Welcome to the Backyard Professor Chess videos. Many chess players that were at the tournament last weekend with me, it was my first chess tournament and I did okay. Well, okay, I didn't do okay, but I didn't get blown off any of the chess boards. I won one, I had a bye, and I lost three, so I was told by virtually everybody there that everybody gets clobbered in their first chess tournament. I didn't get clobbered. I just lost a few games, and there was a game or two that I shouldn't have lost, and they'll make good lessons for the future when I get to them. To illustrate them for you, many of the players wanted to know more about Jeremy Silman's imbalances, and I think this is a good idea. So I'm going to share many ideas of Jeremy Silman's with you. I'm using his books as my chess course toward my master rating to get my master rating. And I believe it can be done this way. There's many different ways, of course, people gain their master rating. I'm going to use Jeremy Silman's method. The imbalances, as Silman noted, are simply a difference in the board position. When you see imbalances occur, it's not a matter of worrying about whether one is bad or one is good. It's up to the individual players to make use of their imbalances, to improve them and make them good. And the idea is to learn how to read the chessboard, because you're not playing another person. Silman wants you to learn how to play the chessboard and play the position. In order to do that, you have to know what the position is telling you to do. Let me illustrate one of the imbalances. Let's say you open up with e4. Your opponent opens up to e6. You decide to push for more central control so that you push the d4 pawn and your opponent does d6. Now, from the very first two moves, an imbalance has occurred in the chessboard. There is a difference in this chessboard, and this is one of the imbalances Silman talks about, the imbalance of space. The idea is these pawns on white are further up the road than the pawns of black, and therefore there is more territory behind these pawns. It's like building a fence. This particular territory is yours. Increasing your space gives you more room to maneuver and coordinate your chess pieces together. Now that makes eminent sense, doesn't it? It's a simple concept to understand and see. Let's say that you go ahead and push another pawn forward, the c pawn, and your opponent brings out his bishop. And let's say you decide to really expand your territory so that you push the e pawn and your opponent pushes the other bishop. You can still see this imbalance, can't you? Now it's even more pronounced. White certainly has much more territory because his pawns are further toward black's side than black's are toward white's. Now, if he continued expanding pawns, and this is not a chess strategy, I'm simply using this to illustrate the principle of more territory. And let's say black did this, and let's say white brought his bishop out. Let's say black exchanged the pawns here, and white exchanged the pawns here. You can see after even these few moves that white still has more territory, even though a couple of pawns have been exchanged, and now there's an open file for someone to take use of. But there is more space here than black. Black is somewhat cramped. This is one of the important imbalances, the idea of territory space. In the amateur's mind, turning chess misconceptions into chess mastery, Silman lists the imbalances. And I want to read to you from page 1 and 2 in this very important and very interesting book. The heart of my system of training is based on an understanding of the dynamic and static differences, known as imbalances. And these exist in every position. It's not, if you see an imbalance, it's not that one player is out of whack and the other one is perfectly fine. That's not what an imbalance is. It is simply a difference in the two positions, such as this position here. By recognizing the different imbalances in a given situation, a player of virtually any strength can understand what his responsibilities are toward that position with relative ease. For instance, in this quick illustration I'm giving you out of my head, White's plan would be, I have an imbalance of territory, I want to proceed to nurture that imbalance. It's a good imbalance for me to have. Black is a little more cramped. He's not going to have as much space to maneuver his pieces around, so he won't be able to coordinate either an attack or a defense, whereas White has more capability of maneuvering himself, of giving himself a chance to put together a better game. This is the idea of the imbalances. And virtually anybody of any strength can begin to see these happening once we understand what an imbalance is. Note that I use the word responsibilities, Silman says. Now this is a very important point. A player can't do anything he wishes to do. That's interesting. You cannot do just whatever you wish to do in your chess game. For example, if you love to attack, you can't go after the enemy king in any and all situations. Instead, you have to learn to read the board and obey what it dictates. If the board wants you to attack the king, then attack it. However, if the board wants you to play a quiet positional game, then you must follow that advice to the letter. And he shows a very interesting illustration, but he lists the imbalances, and that's what I'm trying to get to. The imbalances in any game, which I will illustrate, are the minor pieces. The play between the bishops and the knights. That's a very important imbalance. Silman spends a lot of time discussing that. Pawn structure. This is a broad subject that encompasses doubled pawns, isolated pawns, backward pawns, passed pawns, etc. And I'll do several videos on those also. Space, the annexation of territory on a chessboard, the one I've illustrated to you today. Material, owning pieces of greater value than the opponent's. The files and squares, files, ranks, and diagonals act as pathways for your pieces, while squares act as homes. An entire game can center around one particular file, or a particular diagonal, or a particular square. It depends on what the imbalance is that's being shown on the board, what you see. Development. A lead in development gives you more force in a specific area of the board. This is a temporary imbalance because your opponent eventually will catch up to you in development. And then the initiative, which is the idea of dictating the tempo of the game. This is also a temporary imbalance. So the minor pieces, the pawn structure, the space, the idea of material, files and squares, development, and initiative. There are 7 imbalances that I want to show you various ideas about that Silman has discussed that come about in every single game. Some imbalances come and then they disappear through the course of the game. Other imbalances are permanent throughout the course of the entire game. It's very interesting to know when you're going to have to play quietly or when you're going to have to play dynamically, fast, speedy, hurry up and attack a certain square, catch control of a specific file. In this instance, White's going to want to develop his knight, as is Black, but he can't pull it here because of his space. That's the logical square Black needs to go to. So you can begin to see the importance of the imbalance of space here already, can't you? Black can't pull his knight out to here. If Black wants to get his king to where he can castle, he's going to have to move his knight over to here onto the rim, and a knight on the rim is dim. There's less influence. This has nothing to do with the center where all the power and action is, etc. And then White can hurry up and castle. Voila. Black can go ahead and castle. Voila. and then the fight for the file begins. This entire game would be using the extra space of white and the file here, because it's on the king side. The idea of the imbalances are in every phase of the game, and there are areas of the game that more than one imbalance can occur, all at the same time. So as we train our eyes to learn how to read the chessboards and see the imbalances, we begin to know how to play better chess. I have another illustration of another imbalance I want to give you. I love this illustration in his book on the idea of imbalances and many imbalances and how they can help us actually understand what's going on in a game. When you look at this diagram, what do you see? Now, when I first saw this, I didn't know what the heck to make of this. As Silman explains this, you begin to see the ideas that you want to do. It is virtually impossible at this point for black to start attacking white's king, because white might have a better development and more space. So if black panics and says, oh my gosh, I've got to go after the king, that would be a complete gross error. This is not the idea at all. Silman breaks this down to show us this principle of imbalances. It's beautiful how he does this. We're not looking at individual moves. He has this, I've got to go here, I've got to go there, I've got to do this if he does that. If he does this, I've got to do this. If I do this and this, then he might do this. No, that's the wrong way to approach this. You want to see the overall board. You want to see what this board is telling each white and the black players to do in this particular setup. The one thing to notice is that black has both bishops, whereas white only has one bishop, but both knights. That is an imbalance because the position is fairly open. There's not a whole lot of clutter over here in the center. There are a couple of pawns. This makes us believe that the bishops are going to prove superior to the white knights, because bishops like chessboards without a lot of pawns in the center because they have those long diagonals. So black is going to play to keep the center open. A serious mistake black would make if it was his move is if he pushed this pawn here. Why? Because it closes off his white bishop more. It doesn't completely close his bishop off. That's not the point. You do not want to fill the center with pawns if you have both bishops and your opponent only has one. You want your bishops to be superior to his knights. On the other hand, white is going to want to set up a pawn chain somewhere and put a bunch of pawns out in this center to close the board. Does that make sense? If you're black, you're fighting to keep this board open. If you're white, you're going to want to find a way to put pawn. You're going to want to keep that pawn right there and support that pawn. The pawn structure, there's no weaknesses in black's pawn structure. The only pawn that can be looked upon as potentially weak is this e5 pawn, right? Space, white has the spatial advantage in the center thanks to this e5 pawn. The material is even if the material is different, it is even. Each side has 3 minor pieces, both rooks, the queen, and the same number of pawns. But the difference between the 2 bishops versus the 2 knights is a significant imbalance. It will dictate how you are supposed to play this game depending on which color you have. The files and squares. The D file is open. That's one thing you always want to look at. But neither side has managed to occupy it with a rook just yet. The F6 square is potentially weak. Now, why is that? Because black has advanced his G-pawn and his E-pawn forward. They can no longer influence this square. Only the bishop is influencing this square. Therefore, it could be a potential square later in the game for white to put one of his knights onto, because knights need advanced support points. Knights like this position. Black, on the other hand, is going to want to get rid of that pawn eventually. That pawn is going to be a target for black. Isn't that interesting how noticing the imbalances gives you a way to play in this game? The development, white has a lead in development. The initiative, it's not clear at this point who is dictating the tempo of this game. Now, if you didn't find all the imbalances, that's okay, he says. What we're looking for is to train ourselves to examine every chess position and list the imbalances and see if by listing the imbalances we come up with a plan of play. And he plays through this game, annotating it as each of the players. This was played in the U.S. Open in 1993. I can't pronounce the player's name, sorry. So, he says the goals of both sides should be clear with these ideas here. White must defend his e-pawn here and find a way to advance his knights forward to make them active, because the further up the board the knights go, the stronger they become. Until you get to the 6th rank, which is the zenith of power for the knights. Past the 6th rank, you have diminishing returns. And black will play to keep the enemy knights out of his territory. He will take away their advanced support points. This is the way to beat the knights. And he's going to tie down white's pieces to defending this pawn. Therefore, since black threatens to place his pieces on ideal squares by, say, bishop c6, which gives him a very beautiful long diagonal, he's eyeing f3 here, this knight, which is one of the defenders of e5. So it's good to put pressure on the defenders of this pawn because that's the target for black. You see how that works? And he's followed up, he says follow it up by knight to d7 because, why? It's easy to see, isn't it? He's going to attack a supporter of the pawn, and at the same time, he's going to bring out his knight to attack that pawn. Now, white must respond and react by defending that pawn, finding ways to make sure that pawn does not fall, because that's one of his imbalances, is the extra space that pawn gives him. Does that make sense? It's a beautiful concept how Silman does this. It is very instructive how Silman illustrates this particular game using the imbalances that's on this board. The idea is white's going to play knight to b5. Now, white is trying to find a weakness or probe to create weaknesses in the black position. This places the knight on an active square and it attacks c7, as you can see. Well, the bishop simply eliminates the knight. Bishop takes b5. That takes care of that position. And now the bishop takes this bishop, puts the king in check. And of course, the way he gets out of check is simply pulls the pawn up. So far, white hasn't had a chance to make a dent in black's position at all. And now the target is going to be the c5 pawn for black. So he's going to tie white down to defending that d5 pawn. For one thing, white does not have his dark squared bishop, while black does, and it's pointing directly at that pawn. So, in order for white to retain the initiative, he's going to have to defend that pawn, and then he's going to lose the initiative. Black will dictate that he's going to take that pawn if he possibly can. Isn't that interesting how that works? Now, it's true, pushing this pawn does create a hole here in d6. That's true. Now there's a hole in black's position. And it's a beautiful hole for an outpost for a knight if white can knock a knight up into that position. But that's the question. Can white put a knight there? Black's not going to just sit there and let him do that. You see how that works? So he brings his bishop back down to c4, and Black immediately begins operations against the e5 pawn. He brings his knight to d7, which attacks the pawn. Now this pawn is attacked twice. It's only defended once. And notice this. We have an undefended bishop here. So white has to take care of these two problems now. He's basically on a defense while black has gone on the offense. You see how that works? Because they each understand the imbalances. Well, white rectifies that by bringing the queen up to d4. Now it's a central thrust. It's a good control of the central area. It protects the pawn again. Now it's got a double protection, and it defends this bishop. So what is black's next move? Does black all of a sudden give up and say, well, I'm never going to be able to get that pawn, so I better go after the king. I better do a king-side attack. That would be utterly ridiculous for black to do that. That is not what black is thinking. The game continues to revolve around the imbalances that are present. Black's going to exploit the fact that he has the dark squared bishop, and that pawn is locked on a dark square. So, he brings his queen up to c5, challenging the queen, challenging the pawn. Stillman notes something interesting because of this position. A lot of people don't like to exchange their queens early, he says. They feel it's a wimpy thing to do. However, black realizes here that his goal is not to attack the enemy king in this game. Nor does it have anything to do with other things that might require the queens being on the board. It's okay in this instance to exchange these queens because black ensures the safety of his king, which is still here in the center anyway, and he gets rid of a white piece that can defend this pawn. The goal of this game is to get that pawn for black. The goal of this game for white is to keep that pawn. Black forces the exchange of the queens here, and he's very happy to do so. The queen takes the queen, and then the knight takes the queen. Now we see some more interesting developments. Another file has opened up. Well, white immediately is going to exploit that file, of course. Rook to d1, absolutely. You want your rooks on open files. This is a great way to put it together. White's not going to let that file go unchallenged. He's going to put his rook on that file too. Now it's a fight for the files. Rook takes the rook, check. King takes the rook. One pair of rooks are gone. A rook is also a defender of this pawn. You notice how the pieces are slowly getting whittled down, and because of that, this pawn has become a weakness for white. Rook d1 check. He grabs the d file again away from him. King comes to e7. Now, it's true, black hasn't been able to castle. So he's going to have to be careful this way. He brings his king to e7 so that he can activate his other rook. He needs his entire army in this game, not just one or two pieces. He pops the pawn to h4, and of course he's going to come over here and challenge the rook file again. He doesn't have to let white retain the power in that file. Why? Why would you possibly want to do that? That's silly to do. So he challenges again. And now we can see another point of black's bishop taking the b5 square by creating bishops of opposite colors. Notice this, another imbalance. This is the white squared bishop. Black has the dark squared bishop. And by creating bishops of opposite colors, black is now able to attack e5 with his dark squared bishop, and white cannot defend it. So that is again one less piece to defend his weakness. He only has it defended once. Black's going to get this pawn by any and all means necessary if it's possible. Rook goes to e1. He gave him the file. He has to. Do you see the point? He has to give up this file because he needs more pieces defending that pawn. It's very interesting. He's going to have to move this knight sometime to push this pawn to protect that pawn. When he pushes that knight, wherever he puts it, it's going to be one less defender on this pawn. Do you see how this entire game is revolving around one little pawn? And it's going to determine who wins and who loses this game. Isn't that fascinating? It's utterly incredibly interesting. He pushes the a5 pawn. He comes up to b3. He doesn't want to have any weaknesses here if he can at all help it. And of course, black's going to just charge in. He's going to create weaknesses here. a4, he pushes his g pawn. He realizes the queen side is going to be questionable and iffy, so he better press the king side here because black didn't get a castle anyway. Knight comes back up to d7. You notice this. Again, another attacker on this pawn. He's got two defenders. Black is tying white down to the defense of this pawn. White wants to get something going on the wings. Black isn't letting him. Black isn't freaking out and saying, oh my gosh, he's coming after my king. I have to protect my king. No. Black is concentrating on that pawn alone. This is very critical to do. Brings his king up. He's preparing now, at this stage of the game, to turn his king into a defender of that pawn, because he realizes he does not have enough power to keep that pawn through his pieces alone, so he must bring in his king. Knight comes over here to b6, challenging the bishop. The king comes up to g3. White would be happy to trade off his knight, which can attack e5, for white's bishop, which cannot play a part in the defense. In this instance, it would be fine if he did so. Rook comes over here to a8. Rooks belong behind the pawns. He's going to get a passed pawn, possibly, or if he doesn't, he's preparing to open up this file so that he can come into white's territory. The knight finally has to move. He comes down to d2, and notice this. This knight moved from the attack, so now this frees white to move his knight, and there's only one piece attacking and one piece defending. A takes b3. He opens up the file. However, white takes it with the bishop instead of the pawn in this instance. He doesn't want to give black that open file, so he takes it with the bishop. So the rook comes hopping over here to the other open file and challenging that undefended knight. You see how they're playing with the files and how this pawn is influencing this entire game. Isn't that fascinating? Knight comes up here to f3 again. He's got to defend that pawn. Knight comes back over here to d7. He's going to attack that pawn. King comes up to f4 to defend that pawn. The rook goes back over to a8. The rook comes up to e2 so that he can defend his 7th rank, and the rook comes up here to a5. Now he's going to try to find a place to get into white's territory. White is completely tied down. You notice he's got the attack, and the attack. He's got the defense, and the defense, but he has completely tied white down to the defense of that pawn. And black went on after a long score, after a long hard fight. He eventually did get that pawn and he won the game. This game beautifully illustrates, Silman says, the reason it was played the way it was. The very moves that each player did revolved around the imbalances, revolved around the weakness, and dictated the strategies of creating bishops of opposite colors so that black could attack and white could not defend. That is the reason why white had to bring his king up here, because he needed a third power to defend that pawn. This is how the imbalances actually help you create a plan to play a powerful game of chess. So that's one of the ideas of Jeremy Silman's Imbalances. I'll share more videos with you on others in another video. So thanks for watching my videos, and remember, happy checkmating, man.